common world building mistakes that people make when they're world building vampires. What do you think are the pitfalls? Where do people go wrong? And how can they guard against those things?
Perhaps the number one and most common pitfall is making the vampire omnipotent. The temptation is there to make the vampire so fantastically perfect that they have no flaws, or they're impossible to defeat if they're set up as an antagonist, or they are so accomplished and so perfect that there's actually nothing interesting about them. Nothing is less interesting than perfection. So trying to find a way to make the vampire interesting without it being an omnipotent being is a challenge. And it's not as easy as it seems to do that, right? So the ways to avoid that are to think about flaws, like we've already talked about. Does the vampire have a huge ego, hubris, as you called it, which is a great way to express it? Do they have human flaws? Do they have folkloric flaws? Do they have weaknesses that are physical, mental, whatever, that could lead to deepen the interest in the texture of the vampire, or lead to their downfall? Making vampires all the same. We are vampires, therefore we all wear brocade frock coats and silk, and there is no variation in fashion or attitude between us. Super boring, I think, and a big mistake. And I think that the vampire is so often a dark reflection of the life and times that the author is writing about.
Yes.
It's important, I think, to imagine the vampires that you're writing about in your world in the context of your world. If your world is one in which, elves are the dominant culture or heritage or population, what do vampires in that world look like? They shouldn't be like the vampires from Dracula or Near Dark. They should be vampires that exist as a dark reflection of the culture. And yet too often, I think we just grab the nearest vampire cutout from our favorite film and stick them in whatever world we're writing about. I don't think that's as successful.
I want to follow on for that and say one of the common mistakes I see is people don't work out vampires properly. So you end up with this weird cultural mosaic where, I've decided to have vampires and fae and nereids and space aliens and everything else, and none of them have diplomatic relations or talk to each other or have alliances. They've just gone, splat, here are some vampires. They should be relevant. They should feel thematically appropriate.
Yeah.
They should tell deeper truths about the setting you're trying to create anyway.
That's a great point. Don't add vampires to a world that doesn't need them. But if your world does need vampires, or you really want there to be vampires in the world that you're building, then have some sort of organic or naturalistic explanation that makes them feel like they belong here. They serve a purpose for the story.
I think always my biggest takeaway is when in doubt, go back to your meta. Go back to the themes of your world. Think about those stories that you're trying to tell. Think about that core of your world. And that's going to make them feel like they're strengthening rather than just popped on the top.
Sure, and they can be either illustrative of the theme, as an example of the theme in positive action or in negative action. If the theme of your story and your world is, what is the price of power? And then if that is a core theme, vampires can be excellent illustrative examples at both ends of the thematic spectrum. And
absolutely.
Making sure you go back to the theme to explain why your vampire is here and what they're for in the story can save you so much time and effort later.
I think another one that you touched on, Jason, when you were talking about, the weaknesses in lore and folklore, is make sure you're following your own rules.
Probably a good idea. If vampires cannot enter a home uninvited, make sure that you never break that rule, unless it's part of some fiendishly clever plot device, of course, that you're using. And there are so many folkloric blocks and veins to choose from the vampire mythology of the world. In some cultures, vampires are fascinated by the need to count objects that are placed in front of them. In some, they're hurt by silver. In other mythologies, they're not hurt by silver. Cutting off the head and driving a stake through the heart is a sovereign remedy against some vampires, but not in other cultures and with myths and stories. There's a lot to choose from.
And I think making good choices that, again, feel thematically appropriate and maybe not too many 101 ways to kill a vampire is very hard to follow in world.
Actually, that's a trope I love. And that is the mortal characters trying to figure out, how do we deal with this thing? Does garlic work Does running water prevent their passage? Do I have to weight the coffin with rocks and throw it in a river? I mean, are they allergic to stop signs? How do we deal with it? What is myth? What is fact? What is fiction? And sometimes you can only arrive at the right answer through experimentation, and then it's too late.